in the game, Scotty, and I think you're best placed to fill us in here. It was a great win by Sydney under pretty adverse circumstances. You lose Tippett and then you lose Mitchell in the first term. So you've already used your sub and then you've got a rotation down. What is the flow-on effect throughout the course of the game or the next 3 quarters?
Well, I think the first decision they had to make was obviously how bad is Tippett, because I mean if it's really bad, well, it's an instant decision, you activate your sub. But Sydney generally activate their sub as late as possible, and that's probably, I suspect, because they're worried about getting another injury and the impact of that. So when Tippett was subbed, I mean the worst possible scenario happened when Mitchell got injured almost immediately. So then it becomes, gee, we're down on rotations, we've got to leave our big guys out there. So they went in pretty tall with Pike and Mumford and Jesse White. And then, fortunately for them, I think, they've got a really flexible midfield. So Jude Bolton goes into the midfield. McVeigh started in there, but all of those guys spend a lot more time in the midfield and they're able to share the load.
So we saw the big drop-off in rotation. So what you're saying is the key posts, they stay on the ground, got to play basically 100 minutes, and the midfielders try to do the same rotations?
Well, I think another area of Sydney did it really well. They controlled the ball.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if Carlton had been able to win the ball and control the ball and force Sydney to defend, you would have seen the impact of that lack of rotation and that man down. But Sydney were able to control the ball. They kept it in their forward half for almost about half an hour at one stage. Carlton just couldn't get it forward. So as a coach, you've got to manage your list as best you can that you've got, but controlling the footy is the most important thing.
Speaking of Carlton, you've spoken about Mick's mantra. How do you think that panned out over the weekend?
Well, they need to look at it. There's no doubt about that. Mick's been pretty inflexible with the way they've played the last few years, but I think most teams know where they're going now, where the ball's going. It's predictable to Carlton, but it's predictable to the opposition as well. And you can just see here the long down-the-line kick, which is pretty much every exit from Carlton's back 50. Goes wide, goes to that exact spot there. And Sydney were onto it, and they just kept winning that ball back. When they were under pressure too, Scotty, exactly as you said, down a couple of men, and these sorts of plays just kept them in the game, and it really saved them. When you look at the results, Lynchy, over the last 7 weeks, Carlton have trailed by an average of 3 goals at half-time of every one of those games. Now, that to me says they haven't really got going until Mick's actually said, go and play, take some risks, go through the corridor, tip the whole game on its head in the second half to come back and win the bulk of those games. But against quality sides like Sydney in a final was never going to happen. And I think they really need to assess what the balance is going forward, and I'm sure the off-season will do that for them.
Well, it was very similar to the week before against Richmond. They were struggling against the Tigers, bombing the ball long, but certainly then once they changed up and used the ball short, it was much more advantageous for them.
There's the intercept marks there you can see in that third quarter. Grundy having 8 intercept marks, and obviously Teddy Richards was the other one who was fantastic. He had 7 as well. So they just knew where it was going. They took a few risks, and that's good quality defence as well.
That's the strength of Sydney. I think Grundy and Richards have been doing that for a long time. In fact, Hawthorn probably lost a grand final last year on the back of Sydney's fantastic defence. I think the inside 50s in that grand final last year was 63-42 in Hawthorn's favour. So Sydney are very good at defending that situation. But one thing I know about Mick Moldhouse, he's a coaching veteran of almost 30 years. So he has evolved over the journey, and I'm sure he will again.
You mentioned Hawthorn. The week before we saw the Sydney Swans come up against Hawthorn, and the centre clearances were an issue. We have a look at some stoppage vision from the weekend. So they took on Carlton. They wanted to make a statement from the start. We'll see here, this is the first bounce of the day, and unusually we see here McVeigh in the middle along with Kennedy and obviously Jack. So they've gone in with the big guns to start with. Now, McVeigh averages only 5 clearances. 5 stoppages in the middle of the ground per game, so he's very low. Actually, when he goes in there, he's about the best in the competition as far as that group will get the ball 49% of the game. I mean, when he's not in there, the Sydney Swans go at 44%, so he's a real impact player. Looks like they've tried to make a statement from the start.
Well, the question would be, why wouldn't he be in there all the time?
If he's got that sort of record.
Yeah, and I think this is the dilemmas you face all the time. Sydney last year, mainstays of their defence were Marty Matner, Reece Shaw, Alex Johnson. Well, none of them are there at the moment. So McVeigh's gone back and had an All-Australian year as a halfback flanker. So it's a fair luxury to have. That guy's an All-Australian halfback flanker and thoroughly deserved to put him in the midfield and have 20 possessions in a quarter.
So how does that happen? How do you let a player get off the chain for 20 touches in a quarter of footy?
Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion because we obviously covered the game extensively. When you looked at half-time, the margin was only 20 points.
Yep.
So a lot of the numbers are irrelevant, really.
Yep.
Was he out of control? Was he the one connecting those scores together? Was he the one getting those chains going? Look, he had a part to play. But I'm not sure all of those disposals were as damaging as what we all think. 20 is a huge number. I've got no doubt about that. But they were only 3 goals down.
But he's had 20 possessions, 85% efficiency by foot, 15 uncontested, and he's kicked a goal as well. So, and he's had 3 clearances. So he was using the ball well. He was in space. At some stage, you've probably got to jump on him.
What's going through the mind of whoever's responsible for him?
Oh, look, there's no doubt Mick would have had a few nudges that McVeigh was starting to rack up the possessions, but they had Curnow going to Hanbury, which wasn't really working for them as well as Mick would have liked either. So the question becomes then, what do we do with Curnow? Do we switch him from Hanbury over to McVeigh? Then do we lose both of them? Do Hanbury and McVeigh really start to take off and Curnow is not having an impact on either? So you've always got to look at, OK, everyone could see that McVeigh was getting the footy. No doubt Mick would have seen that too. What he has to assess is what's the flow-on effect from that. If we send someone to McVeigh, what's the domino effect? Do we lose someone else from half-back? Do we put Simpson in there, but then we lose our run from half-back? All those sorts of things go through your mind. So it's not as simple. It's easy to identify what's wrong. It's much harder to identify what to do about it.
The one thing you did do was work hard. We know that Sydney work as hard as anyone. I think we talk about two-way running in the midfield. Yeah. If Kieran Jack isn't the epitome of that, I don't know who is. And we've got a great clip to show here where he actually starts deep in defence. And you can see him. So he's on Chris Judd. And he's worked back deep and he's coming out of the defensive 50. All of a sudden, there's a contested ball up on the wing. He's still drifting past. He's got goal side of Judd. So there's a small gap there. And then he sees the open space and he sees what might unfold. There is a vacant 50 for him to run into. He just puts the head down and goes. Chris Judd trying to go with him, but he runs him off his legs. That is brilliant stuff, one end to the other, and just reward. Because a lot of the times you hear about unrewarded running. I like seeing players get rewarded when they actually do, almost bust a valve or a gasket when they take something like that on.
Well, we're going to talk about the All-Australian team a little bit later, but a little bit of conjecture around Kieran Jack as a half-forward flanker. Yeah. But I've got no issue with him being in the 22. No, I mean, play him wherever you like. He's got that great mix of inside-outside game, got terrific speed, can win the ball in a contest, but as that vision shows, can get forward and score as well.
And it wasn't optimistically running forward. He paused at a stoppage on the wing. He paused for a minute, saw they maintained possession, then went again. So it was just burst running.
Just have a look at Port's game again on the weekend. We've only got the 2 games.